All right, Daniel, what are we talking about this week?
Today we're discussing personal finances being taught in school, the FIRE movement, and politics and its impact on the stock market.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, so personal finance in school, FIRE, politics in the stock market. You picked nothing easy today, so let's have at it.
Great. Well, I want to start first with personal finance being taught in school. So back in high school, I had a driver's ed teacher who said, if you don't learn math, you take it again. If you don't learn driver's ed, you crash. And kind of funny, but what he was getting at was that driver's ed is an essential class, and almost everybody in that classroom at some point in their life will drive and get behind a wheel. And it got me thinking about personal finance. Besides our health, money is really one of the only things we can't escape. And we don't really have a choice to deal with it. It's kind of bestowed upon us. So comparing driver's ed to personal finance, if it's such a necessary knowledge base, why isn't it more widespread in the United States high school, middle school, or even college curriculum?
It's a pretty loaded question, to be honest. So we'll have to pick it apart. I think in the shortest terms possible, historically, education has sort of pendulum swung between being workers' education necessary to hold down a job and perform basic skills in the workforce, and as a gateway towards higher education and higher skills. I think the pendulum largely has been in the latter camp for a number of years, but if you go back to early public schools in the beginning of the industrial age, you obviously had a much bigger emphasis on teaching people literacy and the ability to read, for example, because then they could work more efficiently or effectively in factories and in environments where the ability to read might be more helpful. Whereas in a farming environment or in an agrarian environment, it was a lot less necessary. On the extended part of this, though, why finance specifically? That joke about knowing that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, but you don't know how to do your taxes. Fundamentally, I think there's a couple of things that really push on that. Now, before we get into that, I'll note there are a number of states, a number of school districts that do require personal finance education at some point. It is a growing thing. The Financial Planning Association has made it a pretty big advocacy item to try to advance financial literacy in public education, but it is very much an uphill battle. So what makes up the piece of that battle, or the parts of that battle? I think first and foremost, there is an uncomfortable truth, which is the statistical analysis and observation, particularly data out of Ohio State University and studies done at K-State and Texas Tech, has pretty heavily suggested that people who come from an education background, compared to other majors like business, physics, those sorts of things, tend to have some of the lowest financial literacy of any major group. Now, that's not universal. It's not to say every single teacher on earth is bad at finance, but there's a bias there and a pretty substantial differential between people who are financially literate and financially illiterate, and a very strong correlation between education as an emphasis in education and financial literacy. I think the second factor is that it is sort of treated as a practical skill set. It is thought of as, a trade in the sort of same sense that like wood shop has sort of fallen out of practice, or machine shop has fallen out of practice in a lot of schools. Home ec has always been sort of one of those categories. You learn to balance a checkbook in the same class you learn how to sew and use a sewing machine, and in the same class you learn how to like tell the difference between measuring cup sizes for baking goods. And I think ultimately it sort of gets viewed as a skill set builder rather than an intelligence builder or an academic builder. And so there's sort of an institutional bias against it in the current zeitgeist of K through 12 education being postured as a way to prepare you to go to college.
Okay, so let's stay with this for a moment. You say it's, the curriculum has moved away from skills, and comparing personal finance to, say, let's say exercise. If you want to stay in shape, you can do a bunch of things. You can ride your bike, you can go skiing, you can go swimming, etc. But the main rule is elevate your heart rate for an hour a day and eat within your means. So even if that's a skill and financial planning is a skill, there are still certain things that are concrete and absolute, such as living below your means, pay off debt. Are there opportunities for those, broad and concrete rules to be implemented in any setting?
Yes, I think the challenge is for many of the people who might be involved in the decision about what to teach and how to teach those subjects. There's also a lot of myth making. You have a lot of sources that range from good to bad. You have public recognition of things like Financial Peace University, which I think is great in teaching people how to pay off debt and terrible in teaching people how to invest. You have best selling books like Rich Dad Poor Dad, which will teach you nothing about personal finance except how to commit tax fraud and generally, commit other financial questionable activities. And so functionally, there's a question here about what is genuinely objective financial knowledge. Is it widely held and accepted amongst the educational establishment or people with an interest in that? And from that same standpoint, though, you could sort of argue that there are some financial rules akin to the laws of physics. On the other side of that, you still run into an issue where often there may not literally be anybody qualified to teach those things or who understands those things in the faculty of any given school.
Okay. So, going to give you one more loaded question here. Coincidentally, I actually wrote a paper on this exact topic in college. And a big issue that we found came up was that a lot of these schools thought the onus should be put on the families and the parents to teach these things to their children. Personal finance, as we know, is extremely personal. And, balancing between the school providing and being responsible for that education and or the parents and the family being responsible for that education leaves a little bit of a gap where nobody knows who's really responsible and who should be bestowing this knowledge on the younger generations. Do you think the onus should be more on the institutions or more on the individual families?
To use a controversial example of this, I think that opinion falls largely in the same category as people's opinions on sex ed, which is you've got a range of people who think it shouldn't be taught in school at all and a range of people who think it should only be taught in school. And the problem with relying on the school is the question is, what does the school teach? And the problem with relying on the parents is not only what do they teach, but what do they believe? There is a academic theory and framework for this called the theory of family financial socialization, that children and developing adults absorb financial lessons from their environment, explicit lessons like, a penny saved is a penny earned, or, always pay yourself first, save 10% of your income, all sorts of little rules of thumbs and tips and tricks. But on the other side of that, there are also financial traumas in families. There are financial limitations in families. And again, think about the source. The average American is not financially literate. So from that standpoint, if we're going to rely on the average American across the entire population who is a parent or in a parenting role or guardianship role to teach their children finance, the average American will continue to be financially literate because wherever they're supposed to be learning it from, they are fundamentally not going to be learning high quality information or just outright wrong information. By extension from this, the question of, at the end of the day, should it be taught in by parents versus in schools? I don't know where the controversy is here. Again, there are sort of personal beliefs, cultural beliefs, and biases that can come into this. You have financial phenomenon like money avoidance or money worship, money scripts that can seriously bias how people view and treat money, and how they interact with it and teach it to other people. But fundamentally, the real answer here is financial literacy is going to be gained not only through explicit education, taking a class in school, but it is also objectively learned simply through your observations and your interactions with your peers, with your family, with your community. And though the lessons you learn can be subjective insofar as two people can be exposed to essentially the same parents, the same classes, the same lessons, and have very different views of money.
100%. I think I'm super grateful that my parents bestowed a lot of that knowledge on me, probably without even really knowing it. Buying value over price was a big thing I remember and can see my dad saying in my head. So where do you see this going? Do you see the landscape of financial planning in a classroom setting changing over the next couple of years?
I do think we'll continue to see it be a area that schools begin to adopt and utilize more. I could see some schools trying to compromise with sort of a hybridization. Let's teach algebra, and it turns out algebra happens to go hand in hand with things like lending questions. So maybe we can turn an algebra education piece into a borrowing of money education piece and sort of try to tie those things together. I can see a general push for this because the financial issues faced by our society are getting bigger, despite the fact that we are wealthier as a nation nation, wealthier as a people, wealthier as a species today than we ever have been in history. We have these growing financial frictions, underfunding of retirement, underfunding of long term care, too much demand for support for the elderly, and not enough resources, stress on the current Social Security trust, and so on. And I think the onus has historically been to go from a centralized onus. So, for example, the company pension being your entire retirement plan to an individualized onus in which you have a 401k and the company might help you fund it, but at the end of the day, you're responsible for it.
All right. Well, I won't hold my breath, but I'll look forward to hopefully seeing something come through here. So, transitioning a little bit, I wanted to talk about the FIRE movement. So, financial independence, retire early. It's something a lot of people in our world are pretty familiar with, and it's gained a lot of popularity over the last couple of years. I'll give you a pretty basic question here. What is FIRE, Dan?
It is a somewhat idealistic notion that work is not important, but being able to make decisions about your life is more important. And the best path to doing that is to obtain financial independence as early as possible. And per the name, to retire early, although in practice, I think the emphasis on financial independence is valuable, and the retire early part is perhaps a little more questionable.
Right. I do think the FI is probably of considerable more importance than the retire early aspect of the acronym. So, who typically, employs or looks at this type of strategy?
So fire can theoretically be done by almost anybody. It's just a question of what are your income and what are your expenses and how well can you balance those things. So fire is hypothetically easier in a lower cost of living place than it is in a higher cost of living place, or conversely, it's easier to do when you have high income and not low income. But as long as there's not a unworkable balance of those things, it potentially can be pursued by anybody. Fire, I think, fundamentally appeals to somebody for whom work or a job or a career is a means to an ends, and it is a means to living a quality of life that they want. And as soon as they can get away from doing work to obtain that quality of life, they would rather not work and just enjoy the quality of life. You see a lot of this, particularly in populations like software engineers and developers, people who tend to start their career at higher levels of income and only grow from there, people whose work is not particularly time bound or structure bound. And so you tend to see a lot of orientation towards that in higher earning occupations that also have sort of low barriers to entry, which I think software development, again, is a pretty clear example of that, where you don't necessarily have to go to college to get into it, and you can develop the skill set largely independently, which then lends itself to sort of a DIY approach to finance.
Okay, so living aggressively below your means and trying to save aggressively for a short period of time to have financial independence a little earlier than some other folks. Does that sound right?
That's the basic framework of it. And there's a joke that I like to tell occasionally with clients, which is that anybody in America can retire. It's just a question of quality of life. And that's certainly what's being applied here, is the idea being, hey, if I'm making $100,000 a year, but I can pay my bills with only $30,000 a year, if I can just stick it out and save the other 70,000 net of all the expenses, then that's 2 years of my expenses I'm saving right there. And if I can get it invested early and I can build up enough of a reserve, then as soon as I can grow a big enough nest egg to provide for my cost of living, work is now an optional issue. And even if you don't make it to full independence, building up wealth early in life, building up wealth aggressively does present a number of different choices and opportunities to somebody than somebody who is largely tied up by their liabilities or by their cost of living, who really does need to work to live.
Okay, so thinking about this for myself, right? If I wanted to employ a strategy like this, I'll be frank, I don't want to have to eat cat food for 15 years before I retire. So, how do you find the balance between living aggressively below your means and still pushing for that early financial independence?
I think an element of fire psychology, and there's a whole subsection of fire about being what they call lean fire or fat fire or coast fire, which are all kind of variations or teased themes on how you're approaching what it means to be financially independent and self-sufficient, what quality of life you're pursuing. I think in the sense of how you approach that, something like lean fire says, there are necessities, genuine necessities, right? You have rent or mortgage to pay. You have a certain level of utilities. You have a certain level of groceries you need. but everything else is a comfort item. Everything else is a luxury. Everything else is an indulgence. And so if you really focus in on something like a lean fire approach, you're saying, hey, everything that's not my literal necessities to live is extra, and I'm going to cut that or try to pull back on that as much as I possibly can. Conversely, you can have the fat fire, which just means you want to have your full comforts and kind of regular everyday life comforts the whole way through fire and into fire, meaning that not only will it take you longer to save for, but also you will need to save more to provide for it. But in terms of how you approach that or how you want to get into that, I think you have to have a really honest assessment with yourself. If you're going to go the lean route, which is faster and easier to obtain, how comfortable are you with that? How okay are you with scarcity? And conversely, if you're going to go for a more traditional fire or fat fire approach, how important are those comforts to you? And how important is that independence to you?
Okay, so definitely sounds like there's a portion of the population this can work for. Industries where there's a lot of burnout, maybe highly compensated earlier on in your career, and some of the other factors you mentioned as well. But it doesn't sound like it's for everyone. There are a lot of people out there that would rather have a job or an occupation that gives them purpose that they can show up to every day, and they don't have to retire. For those type of people, this strategy, I'd assume, is really never going to make sense.
Well, and ultimately, that's where I think the distinction between financial independence and retire early really kicks in. I can sympathize quite deeply if your job is something that is not meaningful or fulfilling to you, right? Many people work jobs solely because it's the best way they can make a living based on their skill set, their experience, their capabilities, and so on. And so they just do a job that they don't love or have any passion for, but it pays the bills. And so they would be just as happy to not do it than it is to do it. Some of us are blessed to do a thing we love, and we don't want to make any changes from that. We would happily do it for free if that was practical, because we love the work, or we love the mission, or we love the difference it makes in the world. And that's a luxury. That's a benefit or a perk of certain occupations compared to others. But I think the consequence of that in thinking about who it is or isn't for largely derives from what is the quality of life you're looking to obtain. My somewhat cynical but not untrue take is that if every person on earth pursued fire, we'd all starve to death, right? Because then fundamentally, the byproduct of work is the functioning necessities of society, of an economy, of a country, of the world. And if everybody wants to be financially independent ASAP and retire ASAP, the irony is we would either all starve to death, or because of that sudden impetus, inflation would blow the value of anybody still working through the roof. And everybody who is financially independent would cease to be financially independent because the value of their money would be absent.
All right, I think that's a really good place to leave it. Thanks, Dan. So, as the only fee-only planning firm here in Longmont, I would say we serve a pretty wide variety of individuals and small businesses with various values and beliefs. Would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that. Boulder County has a bit of a liberal lefty reputation, but Longmont has long been considered a bit more of a conservative town, and so we tend to get a whole range of folks around here.
Okay, so that said, you'd probably also agree our clients and businesses have a lot of differing views on politics, and the way they view politics is likely going to view their, long-term outlook on the market. So given, the urgent concerns in the election and, the political landscape, it's a real issue, and it's something a lot of clients continue to bring up in meetings and voice their concern about. So, does the election and the election process actually have a long-term impact on the market?
No.
All right, and podcast over. Great. Okay, so elaborate on that a little bit, Dan, because you're saying no very quickly, but all of our clients have some concern and trepidation about the next couple months here. Where's the disconnect?
I think fundamentally we have a recency bias problem and a negativity bias problem, and that's a well-established empirical observation of human beings in all the academic research and literature. Fundamentally, the conversation we have with, I won't say all our clients, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but many of our clients has a script that goes something like this. I'm concerned that if that guy wins the election, and they can be from speaking from the left or speaking from the right about the left or the right, but they'll say something like, if that guy wins the election, I am deeply concerned about the financial future and the economy of this country. And I actually think this election is a really funny place to say that from the standpoint that both of the leading candidates have been president. One is president currently, one was previously president. And under neither of them did the economy tank or collapse or fail, or did markets collapse or tank or fail, but for the specific and finite events of COVID, which affected both of their presidencies in different ways in different places. And functionally, I think neither of them would have had any economic problems had COVID not happened. And that's just one example, but the long-term trend of all presidencies, whether it's left or right, doesn't matter who's been in office for essentially the last 100 years, has been that the market just keeps going up. And there's little bumps and hiccups and dips and valleys that happen along the way, but the trend line is almost a perfect diagonal on a logarithmic scale when you look at something like the S&P 500 index.
Okay, so in the long term, doesn't sound like there's, that much to worry about. What about in the short term? Does, so say someone on the left and or right gets elected in that month or the next quarter, does the market tend to be more volatile than usual?
It does tend to be more volatile, but the market tends to go up immediately after elections. That's sort of a funny little observation is people sort of seem to think that the market is going to tank because, again, that guy, whichever guy it is, wins, and surely everything's going to crash and fail at that moment. But the trick is the market doesn't like uncertainty. The market tends to be gun shy around things that it's not clear on. And so an election ironically provides clarity. Oh, this guy won, that guy won, this is how the policies are going to go from now. And so the market tends to adjust those pretty quickly. Any volatility or short-term ups and downs you see tend to be sort of a byproduct of the people who'd bet one side losing their bets and adjusting their expectations going forward. But long-term, right, and even when I say long-term, even in the short term, there's not a huge difference made up over who gets elected or when they get elected. I think the conversation that's perhaps a little scarier or harder to have is people who have deeply personalized financial anxieties around the election.
Okay, so stay on that for a second. Deeply personalized emotions and values and beliefs toward the election. How do you navigate a conversation like that with a client? That sounds like a considerably more personal conversation.
Sure. I mean, you've been present for one such conversation recently. This is an individual who is concerned that if one of the candidates wins, that they and their family, and I think I don't want to say rightly or incorrectly, but I think they have a fair anxiety that they and their family, because they are not conventional, they are not a traditional nuclear family, husband, wife, etc. But they're concerned that because of the group that they're a member of, and I won't be specific here, I'll keep that generalized, but they're concerned that that group that they're a member of will become targeted or ostracized, that they could become victims of unfair laws or financial targeting or investigations. And to be clear, this person, this family, this client have not done anything wrong. They are great, wonderful, hardworking American people, but they belong to part of a marginalized group, and they're deeply concerned that if one of the candidates wins, that they may become a victim of essentially a really terrible period in history. Whether that concern is valid or invalid isn't really the call. Like whether that's going to happen or not is really beyond the purview of anything we could say in finance. But the anxiety is real, right? The concern is real. The genuine feeling that your family could be in some sort of danger, whether physical, mental, psychological, or just financial at the end of the day, is a real thing. And I think that's a tougher conversation to have, because it doesn't matter how many charts you could show, how many forecasts you can make, etc. The feeling is real. So to answer your question, how do you directly deal with that? The first thing is to just acknowledge that somebody's anxieties are their anxieties. Somebody's concerns are their concerns. Whether you think they are valid or invalid is not relevant, because they are experiencing what they're experiencing. And from that, you have to acknowledge what they feel. You have to recognize what they feel, and you have to engage in it in good faith. That's not to say that you have to share their anxiety, but you do have to recognize, okay, this is a concern that you have. It is not an unrealistic concern. It may not be probable, but it's not unrealistic. So if your concern is valid, how do you address it? And what can we do to assuage it or ease it in realistic terms? And that becomes just a question of certainty. If somebody is 0% certain something bad is going to happen, they won't take any action. If they're 100% certain a bad thing is going to happen, they should do everything in their power to follow through on that. And your role as a financial planner, or in just talking to a friend or family member at that point, is to assess the probability and their understanding of the probability and to help guide their decisions between point A and point B, whether they should take no action or take only action, and what is reasonable in hedging that bet.
So much really good things there, Dan. I don't even want to try to comment on some of them. Just leave them stand alone. But, you know, these are concerns that a lot of people have, and obviously everybody who comes through our door knows us and can lean on us for guidance during these times. I can't even imagine how stressful this type of conversation is for somebody who doesn't even know who to turn to and really, has no idea if the market has an impact at all. For those people that don't have somebody to turn to and don't know, what's going to happen, is there any advice or, words of wisdom you'd give them for a time period like this?
If we're boiling it down to something like investments in the market, the best advice I can give you is to stop thinking about it as much as you can, or not to fixate on it as best you can. Checking your accounts every day, watching the news every day, being obsessed with the ups and downs, trying to think of a way to be smarter than the market. Unless you have a deliberately short time frame, you're gonna need your money next year. You're gonna need your money in 2 years, whatever it is. Try to just think about the long-term trend, try to take a step back from it. And I think the Venn diagram of things we can control and things that are important is really helpful here, because we should focus on the things that are important that we can control. If it's important but we have no control over it, we don't gain anything by stressing over it or focusing on it. And if it's something we can control but that isn't important, it's not a problem.
Great. Excellent, Dan. So much good stuff in here. Really appreciate it.
So, Daniel, you've had a couple weeks off the podcast here. So let me ask, what is the most valuable thing you've learned in finance over the last few weeks?
I think the most valuable thing is being able to deviate from the plan that you've created to ease the concerns of the client. There's a ton of meetings we go into that we've done a lot of preparation for, and we get into the meeting and I can't tell you how excited I am to show the table or whatever I've been working on all day. But then the client comes in and they say, hey, I have a question about this thing that's completely unrelated. And that's what they remember. It's the value and being able to address their real concerns. And I think that is of equal or even more of importance to the client than potentially the financial plan is, reviewing on a quarterly basis or whatnot. And I think just being able to be that sounding board and almost be a really good listener and just listen to them, acknowledge what they're feeling and their concerns, and then also give them some really helpful guidance on how to move forward is an immense value add that I don't think you can really even quantify.
Well, to that, I'll entirely agree. We work for our clients, not the other way around. So at the end of the day, we should always be here to have the conversation they want to have. And as far as whether that plays along with our planned agenda for a meeting, let's just always remember the great wisdom of the Marine Corps, Semper Fi, always faithful, or in our case, Semper Gumby, always flexible.
Great. Cheers, Dan.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.